Nowadays, more than ever before, we are surrounded by news. In fact, so many news stories appear every day that it's impossible to keep up with them. First of all, there are different kinds of journalists. Sometimes journalists are called reporters because they report the news. Usually, unplanned events are more exciting. However, it's important not to report too much personal information or anything that is scandalous. Nowadays, more than ever before, we are surrounded by news. You can get the news on the internet, on TV, on the radio, and in newspapers. In fact, so many news stories appear every day that it's impossible to keep up with them. And behind all of these stories, there's a journalist. First of all, there are different kinds of journalists, like entertainment journalists, sports journalists, and crime journalists. And they all work hard to deliver the news 24 hours a day, in print and increasingly online. So how exactly do they find and write stories? Let's look at the work of one type of journalist, a city reporter. Sometimes journalists are called reporters because they report the news. So a city reporter is a person assigned to find and write stories about local news. How does the reporter do her work? Well, to begin with, she should keep in contact with lots of different organizations, the local police and fire departments, the offices of local politicians, and religious and civic organizations in the neighborhood. Once the reporter has a good relationship with these organizations, she can call them to see what's happening, or they might call her to tell her about something that's going on. There are two kinds of stories she could write about. The first is a planned event for which the reporter can anticipate many of the details. For example, a politician could be opening a new department store. The second is an unplanned event, for example, a fire or a crime. Usually, unplanned events are more exciting. Let's look at one kind of unplanned event, a crime. Imagine that a fight breaks out between four men in a neighborhood bar, and one of the men threatens another with a knife. The reporter will probably see a few lines about the crime in the police log. Once she knows where it happened, she can go to the scene of the crime and interview people. The first person she will want to interview is a police officer so that she can get the facts. There are four very important facts that every reader wants to know at the beginning of every story. 1, what happened? 2, when did it happen? 3, where did it happen? And 4, who was involved? Once the reporter has the basic facts of the story, she can begin to interview witnesses. When you're interviewing witnesses, it's very important to get each witness's full name and some other details, perhaps the person's job or age. These details will make the story more interesting and credible. However, it's important not to report too much personal information or anything that is scandalous. When the reporter has finished interviewing people, she'll go back to the newsroom to write the story. At that point, she might talk to her editor to decide whether she has a good story. Together, the reporter and editor must decide whether the reporter has enough facts and material to make a good story. Is it clear what happened and why? The single most important question of all is whether or not the story is accurate. If a newspaper publishes a story that isn't supported by facts and somebody finds a mistake, then the newspaper's reputation will be damaged for a long time. For example, if the paper publishes a story saying that Bill Jones started the fight, and later it turns out that Fred Porter started the fight, there would be a problem. First of all, the public would have been misinformed, and people might decide not to access that paper in the future. Secondly, Bill Jones could decide to sue the paper for misrepresenting his character. That's called libel, and it's something that judges take very seriously. That's why many newspapers insist on having every controversial fact in a story supported by 2 different sources. If 2 people who don't know each other both tell the reporter that Bill Jones started the fight, then the newspaper feels it can publish the story. But checking every fact with 2 different sources takes a long time, and there isn't much time in the news world. Yesterday's news isn't worth much to the public, and every newspaper wants to be the first to publish a story. A reporter who has a big story will always want to publish it as soon as possible. So it's the editor's job to check that the reporter has done her work thoroughly and that there are no uncorroborated facts. But let's suppose that the reporter has done her job well. She's checked all the facts and she knows that she's got interesting interviews. Now she just has to write the story. Easy, right? Well, not always. Remember how quickly most people read newspapers? A journalist must know how to organize a difficult story and present it very clearly in language that's simple but very effective. When the story is written, it goes into the computer. Somebody checks that the story is grammatically accurate, and somebody else checks it for typing mistakes. Then a photograph or video is chosen to go with the story, and the editor-in-chief decides where to put the story, on the printed page or online. And what makes a good story? Well, there are 3 main things. First of all, the story has to be new. If it happened 3 months ago, it isn't news. Second, it has to be unusual. There's an old saying in the newsroom: if a dog bites a man, it isn't news. But if a man bites a dog, that's news. Third, it has to be something interesting that your readers want to know about. After all, if they don't want to know about it, they won't buy your newspaper.